All right, welcome to the Jupyter Book 101 AGU 2021 tutorial. My name is Chris Holgraff. I'm the Executive Director of 2I2C, or the International Interactive Computing Collaboration. And today I want to give you a brief introduction to Jupyter Book. In this tutorial, we're going to cover really just the basics of getting started with Jupyter Book. So we'll first create our own small Jupyter Book and create a little bit of content for it. We'll build an HTML website using Jupyter Book. And then finally, we're going to publish our small website online as a public-facing book so that we can share it with other people. As I mentioned, I'm not going to go into a ton of detail, but there are a lot of other great learning material and resources out there. One in particular that I would really like to recommend is another Jupyter Book tutorial carried out by the Turing Way project. This was as a part of JupyterCon 2020, but they have some really excellent content, some excellent YouTube videos to watch, and also the Turing Way itself is a really interesting project and community, and I recommend you all go and check it out. So before moving forward, I just wanted to cover a few background things that would be particularly helpful for you to have familiarity with in order to make the most out of this tutorial. So first off, you should have some basic familiarity with the command line. And that's because a lot of the things that we do with Jupyter Book are done via the command line. You should have some basic familiarity installing things with the Python open source language. So this means using a package manager like pip or like conda. And that's because Jupyter Book itself is written in Python. So while Jupyter Book supports any different kernel or language that Jupyter supports, using the tool itself requires using a little bit of Python workflows. And then finally, you should have some basic understanding of Git and GitHub. And these aren't strictly required for Jupyter Book, but they're the easiest ways to be able to host your books online and share them with other people. And so we're going to use them a little bit in this tutorial. So first off, what is Jupyter Book? For those who aren't familiar, the basic goal of Jupyter Book is to allow people to take collections of computational and scientific content that's written either in Markdown or in a Jupyter Notebook format like IPyNB, package those files together, build interconnections between them, and then build something more like a rich article or book from those collections of files. So either an HTML website or a PDF that looks nicely formatted and is something that you might share with a colleague as a part of your scholarly outputs. So fundamentally, that's what Jupyter Book does. It takes collections of content files, it packages them together, and then it lets you publish them as a book. The goals of Jupyter Book in some ways are to complement other pieces in the Jupyter ecosystem that are a little bit more focused on computation and data science. So whereas JupyterLab or the Jupyter Notebook interface is really good for that exploratory data analysis workflow, Jupyter Book is focused a little bit more on empowering you to author content and to publish content and to communicate with your colleagues and with your peers. So it focuses a little bit more on distributing content in a more familiar and more accessible form for people that are used to reading content online. And it has more of a focus on authoring and publishing, but with a flavor of connecting to interactive computation. So it doesn't want to lose the sort of exploratory analysis that Jupyter is known for, but it wants to bring those components of your workflow into the authoring and the writing workflow itself. And then finally, as with everything else in the Jupyter ecosystem, Jupyter Book is community driven and community led, and it's meant to be as workflow and vendor agnostic as possible. So it'll work locally on your own machine, and it's meant to package and distribute things that you could upload online, you could use with the cloud, you could connect with something like a JupyterHub or a BinderHub. So it's meant to be as generic as possible for lots of different use cases. And really the best place to learn more about Jupyter Book is if you go to the Jupyter Book documentation and website. So jupyterbook.org contains a lot of information about how to set up Jupyter Book, different kinds of things that you can do with Jupyter Book. And the documentation for that website itself is built with Jupyter Book. So it's also a really great source of inspiration for the kinds of things that you can do with Jupyter Book. Okay, so without further ado, we're gonna get started. So the first thing that we need to do in order to use Jupyter Book is simply to set up the environment and install the packages that we'll need. to use Jupyter Book. So the first thing that I'll do is open up a terminal. Down here on the bottom of my screen, I've got a JupyterLab window open, and I'm just going to pip install Jupyter-Book. So when I run that, it's going to use the Python package manager pip. As you can see above, you can also use Conda, which is another package manager in the Python ecosystem. And once you've done that, you should now have access to Jupyter Book and be able to run it locally from your own computer. The best way to test whether or not you have Jupyter Book installed is to simply type Jupyter-Book-help. And this should output a collection of commands and verbs that are available to you as a part of running Jupyter Book. Just as a quick helper, you can also just type JB instead of Jupyter-Book, and it'll basically mean the exact same thing. Okay, so once you're able to type Jupyter Book --help and see an output like this print out, you know that you'll have Jupyter Book installed as expected, and we can move on. All right, now that we've confirmed that the command line tool is installed for Jupyter Book, let's next create a small book that we can use to sort of learn how Jupyter Books are structured and that we can then modify and extend to create our own content. So as I mentioned before, the Jupyter Book command line tool comes with a number of helpful commands and verbs that allow you to do various things to make your life easier with Jupyter Books. So one of those commands is called Jupyter Book create. And what this allows you to do is give it a book name, and it will then generate a folder of that name and copy over a minimal set of files and content to help you get started with your own book. So I'll create a book called my book name. And when I run this command, we'll see that Jupyter Book creates that folder. And if I go inside that folder, there are now a bunch of files in here that I can use to build and preview my book. And this is actually a superset of everything that you need. So for example, you don't need to have a logo.png file or a references bibtexts file, but this is just to show off a few different parts of the functionality of Jupyter Book to give you some inspiration. So what I'm showing you here is the sort of minimal set of files that you need to have in order to build a Jupyter Book. And this basically comes down to three things. You need to have content files. So those are Markdown files, Jupyter Notebooks, basically text-based files that define the actual content of each page in your book. You need to have a table of contents, and this is a YAML file that defines the structure of your book. And you need to have a configuration YAML file. And this is a file that lets you turn on and control various settings in Jupyter Book. So first off, let's take a quick look at the table of contents of my Jupyter Book. So if you look at the table of contents, it also has a couple of different pieces that you need in order to get it working. You need to have a format, and the format tells Jupyter Book what kind of artifact it's generating. The two options that are available right now are JB-book and JB-article. And this just tells Jupyter Book kind of what's to expect in terms of the kind of content that you're giving it. You need to define a root for your Jupyter Book, and this is effectively the landing page for the book. It's the first page that people will see when they go to your book, and usually people use it for some kind of introductory content that helps point readers into the right direction. And then in this case, since we're building a book, the last thing that we need is a collection of chapters. And so this is a list of pointers to these content files. And those files effectively become the chapters in the book. And this defines sort of the order that they're structured in and things like that. So we need a format, we need a landing page or a root document, and then we need a list of chapters. And there are actually other things that you can do with the table of contents. So you can do things like include sections and subsections, but we're not going to go into that detail in this tutorial. The next thing that I'll do is take a look at the configuration file for the Jupyter Book. Effectively, the config.yaml file is a collection of keys and values that let you control the behavior of Jupyter Book. In the slides, I'm showing you a really minimal set of configuration, just as an example. So here, the title defines the title of your book, and that title will then show up in the sidebar of your Jupyter Book when you build it. The author is a way that you can attribute the book to a particular person or organization, and this is going to show up in the footer of each page. And the logo is a path to an image that will then make its way into the logo in the sidebar of your book. So that's just a few different examples of ways that you can use the config.yaml file to control the behavior of your book. If you look at the configuration file that you've just generated, you'll see a lot of extra stuff in here. And this just controls different aspects of the book building process. I'm not going to go into all of the different details, but you can kind of see the comments and follow the links to understand which each one of them does. So for example, this execute section here controls the way that Jupyter Book executes and optionally caches the content of your book. And you can see the other pieces here for more inspiration. So the next thing that I'd like to do is just give a quick overview of the content files that we've created. So first off, I'm going to open up this intro markdown file. And essentially, this is just a regular old markdown file. There are some extra syntax pieces in here, and I'll get into a little bit of detail on that later. But for now, I just want to note that Jupyter Book supports two different flavors of Markdown by default. One of them is called Common Markdown, and this is essentially a Markdown standard that exists across many different tools and applications, but that is also a little bit underpowered. It doesn't have a lot of the features that people want for scientific communication or publishing or reproducibility. So the other flavor of Markdown that Jupyter Book supports is called MyST Markdown. MyST stands for Markedly Structured Text, and it begins with Common Markdown and then just adds a few extra syntax pieces that are particularly geared for interactive computing and scholarly publishing, this kind of thing. For anyone who's familiar with the Python ecosystem and Sphinx, markedly structured text is essentially an attempt at bringing the features of the restructured text markup language into Markdown. So we're trying to combine the simplicity and the understandability of Markdown with the features of restructured text. And this allows you to do a lot of extra stuff that you couldn't do with just basic Markdown. So the other thing that I'll look at is a notebook file. And notebook files are no different in Jupyter Book than they are in JupyterLab. This is just an IPyNB content file that was created with my book. You can see we can display images, we can display math. We have code blocks. In this case, it's going to generate a plot using matplotlib. The only other thing that I'll note about Jupyter Notebooks in Jupyter Book is that your Jupyter Notebooks can also support MyST Markdown. So even though traditionally editors like JupyterLab and the classic notebook interface only support Common Markdown, in Jupyter Book, you can write MyST Markdown in your Jupyter Notebooks as well. And I'm not going to go into it here, but Jupyter Book also supports text-based Jupyter Notebooks. So if you wanted to write an entire Jupyter Notebook just with a Markdown file itself, or even with something like a Python file, Jupyter Book knows how to convert those into Jupyter Notebooks before it builds your book using a text-based tool called JupyText. Okay, now that we've taken a quick look at some of the content files, next we're going to build a small HTML website using Jupyter Book. All right, so we're ready to build a small HTML site from our Jupyter Book. The way that you build books with Jupyter Book is using the build verb. So if I type in Jupyter Book build and then give it a path to a folder that contains a Jupyter Book, so in this case, my book name, Jupyter Book will look at the content files, the table of contents and the configuration and sort of stitch them together in order to generate a book for your content. By default, Jupyter Book is going to generate HTML content because the most common kind of way for people to share their books is as a static website. So if I type Jupyter Book build, my book name, and hit enter, I'm going to begin the Jupyter Book process. And you can see below the output that Jupyter Book generates just to let you know what's going on. In the meantime, what I'll do is take a look at a quick overview of the build process. So as I mentioned before, Jupyter Book has this collection of Markdown files, Jupyter Notebooks, the content you've created as a part of your Jupyter Notebook. When you build your book, what it does is it first goes through all of that content and it finds the executable content that's inside. These are the code blocks and the code cells that, that you might have created in your Jupyter Notebook. It executes those cells and then it stores and caches the outputs so that in subsequent builds of your book, you'll no longer have to re-execute them when you generate your book. This way you can make your book build much faster after the first time that you've built it. It then inserts the outputs from running those code cells back into the content of your book. And so you now have this sort of enriched set of individual files that have the outputs inserted into them. The next thing that Jupyter Book does is it builds a more enriched document model from this collection of individual content files. So that's where it does things like resolves references, it can generate bibliographies and citations, generates figures with labels, that kind of a thing. So at this point, we've taken a collection of independent files and we've now turned them into an interconnected collection, which makes up your book. And then finally, Jupyter Book outputs one of a variety of different output formats. In this case, we've output HTML, but you can also do things like generate a PDF file from LaTeX, that kind of thing. Okay, so the result of running Jupyter Book build should look something like this. This is a little success message that lets you know that you now have a little static website in your folder that contains your book's outputs. The folder that it puts this in will depend a little bit on the kind of output that you've generated. But by default, if you're building an HTML website, it's going to be in a folder called _build/HTML. So let's just take a look at that folder and see what's inside. So I'm going to my book folder here. I'm going into the build folder. I'm going into the HTML folder. And here I can see a collection of HTML files. And this is a static website for my Jupyter Book. So if I double click on the intro HTML file, I can see that this is the structure of the Jupyter Book. You can kind of compare this with the structure of the jupyterbook.org website if you like. And whereas the raw Markdown looks something like this, the built book page will look something like this. So you can see how they kind of map onto one another. The other thing that I want to note is that if I look at the notebooks HTML file and scroll down, I've got the results of running this matplotlib code above inserted into the outputs. And that was done automatically when I built this book with Jupyter Book. Okay, now that we've generated a little HTML site with Jupyter Book, let's create some content of our own and see how we can extend that basic book structure. Since we're creating some new content, I wanted to do a really quick overview of two of the most important features of MyST Markdown. So as I'd mentioned before, MyST is meant to be a rich and extensible flavor of Markdown that has a little bit more of the features that you would want for technical documentation and publishing. It's trying to take some of the sort of values and the principles of the Jupyter project around modularity and extensibility and bring it into the Markdown ecosystem by creating these extension points by which you can extend MyST Markdown into new directions. And when I say extend, what I mean is using roles and directives. So these are the two major extra pieces of syntax that MyST Markdown supports that you may not have seen before. And effectively, roles and directives are kind of like functions, but in the Markdown ecosystem. So a directive is a multi-line function, which means that it just spans multiple lines in your text file. And a role is an inline function, which means that you can include it as a part of other sentences just before and after it. If you look at the structure of these things, they look really similar to functions in other kinds of languages. So they take arguments, they have, in this case, a directive name or a role name. For the block level directives function, they also have some extra configuration so that you can provide key value pairs, and you can also provide content here. And depending on what the function does, what the directive does, you're going to see different kinds of outputs and trigger different kinds of behavior with these rules and directives. So next, let's go back to our original book, and we'll create a new file where we can play around with some of this stuff. So I'm going to create an empty text file here, and I'll call it, let's see, mymarkdownfile.md. And inside this file, I'm going to give it a title. Here's my title. Here's some text. And I'm going to show off two extra things which are, again, unique to the MyST Markdown world. So one of them is called section labels. And section labels are just ways for you to really quickly attach a unique reference to a section header or to a page. What you do is you put this label in parentheses just before the title of a section. So my section title. And then elsewhere in your text, you can insert references to that label, and it'll automatically generate a hyperlink for you. So here I'm referencing, and then I'll say this title. And I'll just give it the name of that unique label that I've added above. So section-label-1. The other thing that I can do is try a reference with no text inside of the Markdown link. So section-label-1. And what will happen is when you build your book, it's going to automatically insert the title text itself, since you haven't specified any text on your own right here. The other thing that I want to show off is how to generate your own rule or your own directive. So the way that you can generate directives, as I showed you in the previous slide, is with 3 backticks. So 1, 2, 3, a curly bracket, the directive name. In this case, I'm going to include a tip, a closing curly bracket, and then some text that gives a useful tip to your readers. And then I can close off my directive with 3 more backticks. So when you add in a tip like this, it's going to render as a helpful tip box when you build your book itself. And we'll show that off right now. So I'm going to save my Markdown file here. And since I've created a new Markdown file, I now need to go into my toc.yaml file and add a new chapter. So I'll go File, My Markdown File. And I've now added a new chapter to my Jupyter book. So I'll go back to my command line and type again, Jupyter Book build my book name. And when I hit enter, what you'll notice is that it usually runs a little bit faster than the first time that you built the book. And that's because your Jupyter book no longer has to execute the pages that it has already executed before. It will only execute content if it sees the code cells having changed from one book build to another. So now let's go back into the build folder and take a look at the file that I just created, my markdown file.html here. When I double click it and look at the file, I see that I have my section title here. I have a reference to this section title here. As I mentioned before, the title will get automatically inserted if I don't provide my own text in the Markdown link here. And here's that tip box directive that I used below. And as I mentioned, there's a lot of other stuff that you can do with MyST Markdown, but this is just to give you a taste of the kinds of things that are possible. Okay, now that we've generated our book and we've created some of our own content, the last thing that I want to show you how to do is how to now publish and share this book online so that other people can find it. All right, so now that we've built a simple HTML website from our book, and now that we've also added a bit of content our own, let's now publish this book online. The way that you can publish a book with Jupyter Book is using GitHub, and specifically a feature called GitHub Pages. I should note that there are a number of other ways that you can publish books online, but this one in particular is pretty straightforward and easy to do. So if I go to github.com, it's going to open up my account. And I'm just going to click this little plus button here and generate a new repository. You can call the repository whatever you want to. I'll call it AGU 2021 book. Make sure that your repository is public. You can add in a README file if you'd like to, and then click on Create Repository. So once you do that, Gitbook is going to create a little empty repository where we can put our book content. I'm going to go back to the terminal here, and I'm going to use the git command line tool to clone this repository. So git clone, and then I pass it the URL of the repo that I just created. When I run that command, it's going to generate a little folder where I can put all of my book content. So what I'm going to do is just copy everything inside of my book name and put it inside of my new Git repository. I'm going to do cp-r my book name star, and then point it to the AGU book. So the R and the star basically just mean copy everything recursively inside this folder and move it into this folder here. So when I run that command, I've now done that copying, and I'm now going to change directories into the AGU book folder here. And if I look at the files inside, I see that now I have all of the same files that were in my old folder are now in this repository here. The next thing that I'm going to do is use a really useful tool called GHP import. And this is a command line tool that allows you to really quickly push collections of HTML files to a particular branch in your GitHub repository that GitHub knows to use for your own personal website. So if I first pip install GHP import, this will then give me access to the command line tool that I'll use to publish my book. The way the GHP import works is that it detects what repository you're inside of in whatever terminal session that you've got running. So when I do things like try to publish things with GHP import, it's going to automatically use whatever repo is currently active. So in this case, the way to use GHP import is to type GHP import. I'll give it a few different flags, and these are just sort of helper flags that tell GitHub how to treat the different content that's in the book. If you want more information about that, I'm happy to chat about it offline, but there's also a lot of great documentation on this tool online. And then I'm going to give it a path to the HTML files for this book. So when I run this command from inside of the repository folder, it's going to package up all of those HTML files, and then it's going to push them directly to the GH pages branch on my repository. So the way that GitHub Pages works, you should now be able to just go to that branch and see a version of your book having been published. So if I go to my website here, I can see, oh, there's the GH Pages branch that was just created. If I look inside, I can see here's all of the HTML files that I just pushed up there. If you go to your settings page of the repository and then scroll down to the Pages tab on the left, you should see a URL like this that tells you where that book is published. And when I click on that URL and navigate to the page, I can see here's the Jupyter book that I've just published with GH Pages. And just to prove that this is true, here's that custom text file that I just created a couple of minutes ago. So that's a really quick introduction to very basic content creation, structuring your book, and then publishing your book using Jupyter Book. But there's a ton of extra information out there about how you can use Jupyter Book in your workflows. In addition to the Turing Way tutorial that I described before, you can also check out the Jupyter Book documentation at jupyterbook.org. As well as a collection of Jupyter books that have been built by various people in the community at the Jupyter Book Gallery. So that's at gallery.jupyterbook.org. So in this tutorial, we covered installing Jupyter Book, creating a small skeleton book with Jupyter Book Create. We took a look at the structure that's there inside of a book and the sort of minimal content and configuration you need in order to build a book. We covered some basic Markdown and did a quick dive into MyST Markdown, this extensible and more enriched version of Markdown that Jupyter Book supports. And then finally, we built a simple HTML website from our book and then published it online using GH Pages. So thanks very much for your time. I hope that this was an insightful and interesting tutorial for you to follow. You probably have other questions and would like to learn a little bit more about the Jupyter Book ecosystem. And if you'd like to do so, feel free to reach out to me. And I'm also going to be available to answer any questions that you might have. And otherwise, I hope that you've enjoyed this content, and I look forward to seeing you in the Jupyter Book community in the future. So thanks very much.